you everybody for joining me on either Twitter or YouTube or Twitch or Facebook also, if you're joining me there. Thanks for joining me. This is the video premiere of W.E.B. Du Bois versus Booker T. Washington, round 2. This is a follow-up to a previous video, round 1. And if you haven't had a chance to check that out, there's a link to it in the description, but I'm going to be premiering round 2 in just a few moments. And I'll be posting a couple of follow-ups to round 2. I'll probably be at least 4 rounds that will go, that'll introduce new, different philosophies and approaches. So I'm going to premiere this video and do a live sort of Q&A afterwards, address any questions in chat. After this premiere, I'm just going to leave the Q&A part of it, the chat, the questions, etc., and a short presentation that I'm going to do afterwards. So I'm just going to leave that part of it, and the video will be posted as a separate video that you'll be able to find in the description for this video, if I remember to put the link there. By the way, my name is Darius Spearman. I'm a professor of Black Studies at San Diego City College. And this is some of the material that much of which I present in the classroom that I think should be freely available to everyone. And I want to give a huge thank you and shout out to my Patreon supporters. And I don't know if you're a longtime viewer, you probably noticed that the quality of the videos has improved over time, and that's largely thanks to my Patreon supporters who are making this possible. So huge thank you for your support. If you'd like to support this program, you can head over to patreon.com/African Elements, and there's a number of different tiers and a number of different things that I'm offering at each tier, including just ad-free access to these videos for just $1 a month. Also, if you're feeling super generous, you can support the program during the live Q&A. And if you want to contribute, if you're a YouTube viewer and want to contribute a super chat, those comments will be read live on air for any amount. And your support is hugely appreciated. So thank you so much. I'm going to be premiering the video in just a moment, and then after the video I'll go straight into just a couple of other things that I wanted to put in the pot for some discussion, and then we'll have I'll address your questions in the live chat and also read out any super chats. So without further ado, this is the premiere of W.E.B. Du Bois versus Booker T. Washington, round 2. Hey, thank you, folks. So that was the premiere of W.E.B. Du Bois versus Booker T. Washington, round 2. Again, that's going to be after this live stream, after I address some questions and give a short little presentation. That's going to be uploaded as a separate video, but I'll keep this part of the live stream up for future reference. So there's a couple of other things that I did want to throw in the pot from that presentation. In the last video, we looked at W.E.B. Du Bois and critiqued some of the limitations, the strengths and the limitations from Booker T. Washington's perspective. And today we're going to critique Booker T. Washington from Du Bois's perspective. And there's a couple of other we saw some of the limitations that Du Bois pointed out, as well as the advantages that Washington highlighted. But later we're going to add a couple more ideologies to the mix, specifically communism and socialism. My goal here is to help folks develop a theoretical framework and understand that each of the ideologies that they might pursue, whether it's civil rights, whether it's Black nationalism, socialism, communism, etc., they're each going to come with its own set of advantages and its own set of limitations. And it's important to understand what those limitations are so that you can best decide which set of limitations you're comfortable living within. And this is one of the things that I really emphasize for my students as well. I don't see it my goal as to say, I don't see it as my goal to say, here is the best approach, here's the approach that you should be taking. Rather, understanding if you're a Black nationalist, cool, here are some advantages, but these are some of the things you're going to have to maneuver around and figure out if that's your thing. If you are a civil rights advocate, here are the advantages with it, and here are some of the things that you're going to have to figure out. And you have the ability to, once you understand those limitations, you have the ability to pick and choose which aspects of those ideologies you want to adopt. So you're not stuck with Booker T. Washington's framework. You can modify it and adjust it as you see fit if you understand the limitations. So for example, Booker T. Washington and his later sort of protege, Marcus Garvey, who was kind of a disciple of Booker T. Washington, they were much more sort of entrepreneurial, business oriented. We need to build business and enterprise within the Black community, which is fine. It does have its limitations, though, and other Black nationalists recognized those limitations and said, "Here, I like this approach, but I'm going to get around some of those limitations." So, for example, is the business model whose goal is to make a profit, is that the best model on which to base community building, right? Huey P. Newton and the Black Panther Party said no. So they kept some of the core ideals of Black nationalism, but they instituted more of a Marxist socialist economic agenda. So they had some 20 different programs in the community: breakfast for children, free medical clinics, helping folks cross the street to get to school, etc. 200 different programs in the community, none of which were profit based, none of which was based on a business oriented model. So you can do that. You can borrow and grab from here and there to create your own sort of model and theoretical framework moving forward. And so I just see my goal is helping folks to understand, if this is a limitation, here's something I can grab to get around it, right? So that's kind of my goal here. So with that, I'm just going to sort of share my screen, and give me 1 second, share my screen and present some other stuff that I didn't necessarily get to in a 10-minute video. Some other sort of things to keep in mind as we're assessing the strengths and limitations of each of these ideologies. So let me go ahead and share my screen. So here is Booker T. Washington. We talked about his ideology. He was, and some of the weaknesses, some of the strengths and the limitations that come with it. Now, he answered Booker T, some of the limitations of W.E.B. Du Bois's framework by W.E.B. Du Bois relied heavily on the intervention from the state. So the W.E.B. Du Bois and the NAACP tended to use the court system. There are other ways that you can do it. You don't have to use the court system. You can use direct action, but all of which is going to be geared towards interventions from the state. So, for example, the Montgomery Improvement Association that initiated the Montgomery bus boycott in 1954, they relied on boycotts to initiate change. So putting pressure on the system, either through direct action, either through the court system. There's a variety. You can march on a freeway and stop traffic, and see how many days after traffic comes to a standstill we get significant movement on the part of the state. You can take that tack too. Obviously, that comes with its disadvantages. You have to be willing to get arrested. But the court's not the only way to do it. But all of these ways rely on intervention from the state. Booker T. Washington's didn't. And so if you just build your own Black schools, you build your own Black lunch counters, you build your own Black towns, what do you need to dismantle Jim Crow for? What do you need to bother with the courts for? You don't need to worry about that. Obviously, that comes with some disadvantages. Nicodemus, which we talked about before, is sort of highlights one of those disadvantages in that there's only so much you can detach yourself from the infrastructure to, and the question becomes, how truly independent can you be? As it turns out, Nicodemus couldn't survive without some connection with the railroad systems that passed them by. And as a result, the town went into decline. I mean, you could take San Diego as an example. You know, let's say San Diego was its own black town. You know, okay, great. We get our water from the Colorado aqueduct. So if we decide we want to cut off from everything, where are we going to get our water from? You know, so it becomes, that's a question that all Black nationalists are going to have to address. Bayard Rustin addressed it in a little bit different way with Malcolm X, where Bayard Rustin, who was an integrationist, had several debates with Malcolm X and, you know, challenged him on his ideology of political sort of creating an independent political identity, independent political entity within the United States where Black folks could have some autonomy. But the problem with that was that the Nation of Islam that he was a part of at the time didn't get involved in politics in any form. So Bayard Rustin challenged him on that. He's like, okay, how are you going to create a separate Black entity for Black folks, a separate Black state or separate Black reservation or whatever your goal is? How are you going to do that without the political cooperation of the very entity that you're seeking to separate from? And Malcolm X kind of said, well, I can't. And that was one of the major things that led him to leave the Nation of Islam. He realized that that was a limitation, that he could not carry out the agenda that he wanted to carry out within that organization. So he recognized the weakness and he left and he formed his own organization. But that's what this process is about. And that's why I respect Malcolm X, not only for his willingness to engage with Bayard Rustin, but for his willingness to critically reflect and say, how is this working? And is this the best way to achieve my goals? And are there limitations? Ultimately, he decided, yes, the limitations were too much to do what he wanted to do. And so he left the organization. That's oversimplifying it somewhat. So we touched on some of those limitations. We also touched on the limitation of not necessarily having a focus on rights, which means that any prosperity, anything that you can build can be jerked right out from under you. Case in point, the Tulsa race riot on June 1st, 1921, in which Black Wall Street was destroyed, which was a thriving Black community. But there's another limitation in there that I didn't touch on in the video. And that's that a lot of people, and people don't like it when I bring this up. As a matter of fact, I got kicked out of a Black history group for bringing this up. But a lot of people look at Black Wall Street and say, hey, we need to bring back Black Wall Street. We need Black Wall Street, Black businesses. And I'm fine with that I'm not against that, but people bring it up as if every person in Tulsa, every Black person in Tulsa was a business owner. And there was nobody taking out the garbage. There was nobody sweeping the floor. There was nobody operating the cash register. Yeah, everybody was just business owners. And that's not how capitalism works. You know, so the other challenge becomes, how do you create Black business and Black enterprise without replicating all of the problems that come with capitalism, that is a 1% owning class and people who work under them making starvation wages? If that's the way it looks in mainstream America, why would it look any different if Black people were doing it, right? And that's why the Black Panther Party decided, hey, maybe this isn't the business model, which is centered on profit, isn't necessarily going to be compatible with the goal of community building. And so they adopted a different model. They recognized that, like Malcolm X, they recognized that weakness and adopted a different model, right? Again, so you have to understand the limitations in order to do that. Moving on to W.E.B. Du Bois, again, we talked about how critical he was of Booker T. Washington and pointing out some of these flaws. But obviously, W.E.B. Du Bois had shortcomings of his own that he had to work through, which I talked about a little bit earlier, and I'll get into a little bit with the discussion on Marcus Garvey and the Communist Party. But you know, these are folks that had bitter rivalries with one another. They didn't get along, and it was built into their ideologies that they wouldn't get along. You know, integration and separatism don't mix. They just fundamentally don't mix. So it's not surprising that Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois would not see eye to eye. There's reasons, there's built-in problems or built-in conflicts with communism and, well, not integration, but communism and the NAACP and their goals. That I'll talk about later in a later video when I talk about communism. But these conflicts, it's not all, doesn't all just boil down to egos, although some of it is. It's also just sort of embedded within the ideologies that there's going to be conflict. W.E.B. Du Bois, we talked about the notion of the talented 10th, and that there are, in his view, 10% of the population that is able to lead the Black, to exercise leadership in the Black community and lead the Black community to prosperity. That led to, or that lends itself to a sort of what I refer to as respectability politics. And that is the notion that the idea that conformity to mainstream standards of appearance and behavior will protect marginalized groups from prejudice and systemic injustice. That ideology lends itself to respectability politics. And we saw a lot of that in the video on the Harlem Renaissance. This was the whole debate that was going on in the Harlem Renaissance when we were deciding which Black folks, which Black voices should we bring forward now that white folks are watching. And, you know, W.E.B. Du Bois wanted to highlight only the positive aspects of Black community and tended to look away from, you know, other areas where, for example, Langston Hughes and Zora Neale Hurston didn't necessarily shy away from, because they weren't there. It wasn't their goal necessarily to look good for white people. As Langston Hughes said, you know, if white people are pleased, we're happy. If they're not, it doesn't matter. We're going to express ourselves in our own authentic voices. And we know that we're beautiful and we're ugly too. Deal with it, you know. But W.E.B. Du Bois tended to shy away from subjects like, you know, prostitution and jazz and drug use, etc. And a lot of venues tended to shy away from that. We talked about that with Billie Holiday, and her voice not being heard necessarily in certain venues because of her subject matter made white folks uncomfortable. Southern trees bear strange fruit, blood on the leaves, blood on the root, made a lot of white patrons uncomfortable. So it lent itself to a respectability politics, and that's one of the limitations of the civil rights movement as well. And we see that here. Most of you probably know these two people, but I'll bring it up anyway. On the left, we have Claudette Colvin. On the right, we have Rosa Parks. Everybody knows who Rosa Parks was, initiated the Montgomery bus boycott in 1954 when she failed to, she was actually sitting in the colored section when she failed to move, but the system was such that even if you're in the colored section and a white person wants your seat, you have to move. So she refused to move and was arrested. She wasn't the first person to be arrested. On the left, we have Claudette Colvin, and she was arrested a few months before Rosa Parks. The NAACP shied away from that case because Claudette Colvin became an unwed teen mother, and the NAACP decided that this probably wasn't the person that they wanted to bring forward in a case that could garner national attention. So respectability politics has limitations in that you have to be careful in terms of who you pick and choose to represent the movement. It also lends itself to issues where if the leader of the movement is found to have some moral shortcomings, that could lead to the downfall of the movement. And that's also one of the things that the FBI tried to use against Martin Luther King when they discovered that he had had several affairs. So, and by the way, Mary Louise Smith wasn't the only person who the NAACP also decided not to go with as far as the integration case. Another young woman by the name of Mary Louise Smith was also arrested. The NAACP shied away from that case, not because of anything that she did, but because her father was rumored to be an alcoholic. So these are, if your goal is integration and you want to show people, hey, black folks aren't so bad, black folks, we're just like you, we're good people. You don't necessarily, you won't necessarily be promoting the interests of or putting forward folks like Mary Louise Smith, folks like Claudette Colvin. Thanks, folks. So we have a couple people joining us, and let me move this out of the way. So again, I'm Professor Darius Spearman, professor of Black Studies. That was just a couple of issues that I wanted to bring forward with regard to W.E.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington and their ideologies. I think one of the main things that I want folks to get out of this, as in addition to an understanding of, here's one ideology, here are the limitations of it, here are the things that I can do with it, here are the things that I can't do with it. In addition to that, one of the things that I wanted folks to get out of this was to understand that there's a reason why these ideologies didn't mix very well, and that, you know integration and, black nationalism, separatism, the goals are fundamentally in opposition to each other. So there's a reason beyond egos why W.E.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington didn't mix very well. And sometimes this got really ugly. I mean, Booker T. Washington undermined W.E.B. Du Bois in every way possible, but it didn't stop. It didn't stop there. You have later on, a Philip Randolph, who was a socialist, and there's built-in conflicts with them too, referring to Marcus Garvey as that supreme Jamaican jackass. Marcus Garvey kind of firing back at the NAACP, and W.E.B. Du Bois referring to the NAACP as the National Association for the Advancement of Certain People. And of course, he had a point there because of, again, the respectability politics that I was talking about. But it even went beyond that. There was, obviously ego conflicts, but a lot of people don't realize that Thurgood Marshall had worked with the FBI to undermine the Nation of Islam. So these movements, when these conflicts get going, can really do a lot of harm to one another. And there's reasons why it's difficult for them to work together, but it's not impossible. We do see the civil rights movement at its best when, for example, Martin Luther King and Malcolm X can use one another to make each other better. And I would argue that that's exactly what happened, that Martin Luther King wouldn't have been as effective had it not been for Malcolm X, had it not been for the fact that, hey, you can give Martin Luther King the rights that he's demanding the way he's asking for it, the peaceful, the nonviolent way. But if you don't want to do it that way, that's where Malcolm X stepped in and said, hey, we got some other folks that are going to do it another way. So that's when all of a sudden Martin Luther King became a lot more palatable and became you had a lot more movement when you had the more militant, um, more other movements with that weren't bound by the nonviolent ideology, that were stepping forward. And all of a sudden you had some movement on the civil rights front. There are ways that you can use one another to bring each other forward, and I think Malcolm X understood that, and he was very deliberate when he said, give Martin Luther King what he wants the way he's asking for it, because if you don't do it his way, other folks are going to come along and do it another way. Again, that made Martin Luther King better. So there are ways that we can use these different ideologies to make each other better, right? Unfortunately, that's the exception rather than the rule. And I kind of wanted to leave you with that. Another good example would be with the Communist Party that I'll be talking about in the next video. One of the strengths that they had Well, one of the limitations that the NAACP had was, again, with this respectability politics. We see in the 1930s, there's a lot of poor Black folks. And in 1932, there's 9 unemployed Black hobos that are accused of raping 2 white women. Not exactly the type of case that the NAACP would be busting down the doors for. Not super gung ho about representing poor Black folks who might put the Black community in a bad light. Communist Party, on the other hand, had no problem working with poor folks. So the Communist Party jumped in and probably saved their lives, the Scottsboro Nine. And so the thing is, you know, if there is a limitation that you had, and the NAACP clearly had a limitation, we need to be able to put our egos aside and let other folks step in and say, here, you got this. This is your thing. Communist Party stepped in and said, this is right up our alley. We don't mind working with poor Black folks, right? We need to be able to do that. And unfortunately, historically, that hasn't been the case. So I wanted to kind of leave you with those 2 things, just an understanding of the strengths and limitations, and just an understanding of being able to put egos aside and having the civil rights movement, or the movements, at their best when they're attacking white supremacy from multiple fronts. That's a strength, right? Not necessarily a limitation. So it's good that we have a Black nationalist. It's good that we have civil rights folks. It's good that we have communists. It's good we have socialists and people of different economic beliefs, because what one person's weakness is might be another organization's strength, right? So thank you so much for joining, and I will be posting the follow-up video, round 3, on socialism and communism, probably within the next week or 2. I'll be doing another live stream then, probably. And until then, I will see you in the comments.